January 2026 is the hinge of this war because now we see that Russia is losing control of timing, and timing is what holds Russia's war together. When Moscow controls timing, it chooses escalation, concentration, and it chooses the next move. But when Moscow loses timing, it bleeds in places that it cannot emit, and it cannot recover the initiative. Ukraine is now setting the pace, and Russia is reacting late. Ukrainian strikes are forcing Russian air defenses to sprint, to redeploy, and to guess. Russia is moving defenses after they've been hit, not before they strike, and each redeployment leaves a seam, and Ukraine is hitting the seam. The mechanism is a loop that Russia cannot break out of. A strike lands, so Russia shifts air defenses towards the last hit. The shift exposes another corridor, and then Ukraine hits the newly exposed corridor. The rear stops behaving like a safe zone and starts behaving like a battlefield. And Russia cannot protect everything, and Ukraine does not need to strike everything. That shift in geography changes the war's financial math. Russia built this war on the assumption that their rear would stay safe. Offshore energy, interior logistics, and deep infrastructure were treated as protected zones. That depth was supposed to keep paying for the war while the front consumed all the men and the shells. But Ukraine is proving the rear can be targeted, pressured, and disrupted, and Russia now has to spend to defend the rear while still trying to fund the front. The rear was supposed to fund the war, and now the rear is becoming a part of the war. My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a National Security Advisor and a Kiev Post special correspondent who was blacklisted by the Kremlin already 15 years ago. If you want to get the news of what's really going on, not just the headlines, please subscribe now. Thank you. So the Caspian example that we've just seen shows what happens when depth becomes targetable. Ukrainian strikes were reportedly carried out in the Caspian Sea, going after the Vladimir Filovsky, the Yuri Karjagin, and the Valery Gerfer. These are the long-life revenue assets designed to fund years of state income. In fact, the Filovsky was assessed at 129 million metric tons, 142 million short tons. The consequence is not symbolic, it's quite important. Russia must either defend assets it never planned to defend, or absorb repeated losses. Now, once the rear is contested, logistics become a choke point. Fuel movement shifts toward rail corridors when other routes feel exposed. Rail capacity is finite, and extra fuel loads, it displaces other war cargo. That means that ammunition, spare parts, food, and industrial inputs get pushed back. So Russia runs on rail, and distance that they have in Russia are pretty great, which only magnifies the problems. Supplies cross thousands of kilometers before they reach the front. So when a train slips, cities feel it within days, and the front will feel it within weeks. Ration movement becomes a political allocation. Predictability breaks, and favoritism becomes visible. Today, we see that there are more and more problems for the Russians, though, because it's not just in the territory of Russia, it's also in the occupied territories. Crimea demonstrates how tempo pressure spreads from the map to the daily operations. In fact, there was more reports last night that the Belbek Airfield in Crimea was struck. Now, what's interesting about that is it's becoming more and more risky for the Russians to count on their airfields. Without those airfields, they've got a lot of problems. We know that the bridge is often a target for the Ukrainians. It's only a matter of time till it sinks. But outside the bridge, they also have ships. But we've seen that the Ukrainians have become very good at striking Russian ships. So those airfields are very important. If they were to lose, let's say, the bridge and their ability to use ferries on the same day, they'd only have the airfields left to be able to get transport back to mainland Russia. But that's why Ukraine increasingly going after things such as the airfield, going after things such as their defense inside of Crimea makes Moscow so nervous. They know that Ukraine wants to have the peninsula back, and that it will. But that's why Ukraine counter these attacks is so strategically wise, because it means that Russia will undoubtedly send more air defense to Crimea. It'll do everything necessary to protect the peninsula. Russia considers Crimea to be a key feature of modern Russia. It's illegally occupied, but still, they're very proud of it. Vladimir Putin personally is very proud of it. And that's why it is so important to always signal that soon the liberation is about to begin, because the Russians will 100% begin to panic. There's nothing they can imagine that'd be worse than to see something like Crimea fall. But increasingly, it seems realistic. It is not just a fantasy. We see that Russia does not have the capacity to continue waging this war, not financially, but also they do not have enough money to keep fighting this war. Consider the fact that just a year ago, the Russians were offering incredible amounts of money for anyone who would join the military. In fact, the bonuses just about a year ago were about $39,000 for the people from Tatarstan. Today, they've dropped that money. Today, it's going to be only about $10,000 for those who join the military, 4 times less. Now, why is that? Why is it that there's so few Russians who want to join the war? Well, it wasn't initially this way. In fact, the only regions of Russia that became wealthier in the past few years are regions that were so objectively poor before that the money they got for joining the military was a boost to the local economy. Places like Tatarstan gained from this, but overall, it's not a healthy sign because today there's so few men that even though they're being offered money, they refuse to join the military. Russia today is getting more and more troops in places like Africa and Latin America. Now, what's incredible about it is the number of stories coming out showing that the Russians essentially trick people to join their military. Many of these people believe they're to come and work in a factory or to work in something like construction. They don't think that they're going to be joining the war effort. But we've seen the Russians and their cruelty do take in a lot of foreigners. And these foreigners, who they then essentially enslave and send off to the front, never to return. But for Russia, it's going to be harder to continue doing that because just doing that, it costs money. So some might ask, why don't they just conscript more of the soldiers in Russia? Obviously, there's a lot of Russians. Can't they join the military? Well, Russia has moved to year-round conscription. But there's a problem with that. Vladimir Putin is a dictator, but he realizes dictators can fall out of popularity very quickly. And one of the things that can do that is by forcing men to go join the military. So the last thing he wants to do is get his rank and file Russians across the country to have to leave their jobs, leave their families, and go join the military. That might make him very unpopular, but it's also very expensive. But there's another thing that's going on here that's important to note. You've seen all the economic chaos inside of Iran and the political chaos that's come from that, the massive protest, the destabilizing protest. It's a good lesson for history. When we see a revolution in a country, one of the factors that usually fits into that, one of the reasons that it happens, is simply that economic chaos. People don't want that. But the situation in Russia is not one that can avoid incoming chaos. Keep in mind, they've lost over a quarter of the national budget in the course of just a few weeks due to lack of oil sales. Today, we see Ukraine is routinely attacking Russia's ability to refine oil within their own country. We see Ukraine is attacking the tankers that transport Russia's oil in the Shadow Fleet. Now, if Russia is routinely being attacked like this, how can it continue to finance this war? How can it continue to keep going? The truth of the matter is, it can't. It's today allowing its banks to give out more loans without collecting collateral. And why is that? Because there's not enough collateral, but they need to keep the liquidity going. They need to keep feeding businesses cash so they keep working. Russia overall is in a very complex situation, and it's a situation that gets more complex the more you read about it. But there's something very interesting here. It's the fact that so many people around Vladimir Putin, most likely it appears, are telling him that everything will be fine. Everything is going just great. Now, everybody on the outside realizes that Russia is a basket case, that losing Venezuela as a partner, that losing, potentially, Iran, we hope very soon, will be another major blow. But where does Russia go from there? Who else can it count on? Well, we've seen that the Chinese and the Indians did not come to Russia's support. Russia had really counted on them, thinking that after this war started, they would always stay loyal. They'd always work together. But we've seen historically that Russia has used and abused the Chinese. It has not always had great relationships with the Indians. And that's why today, neither countries can stick their neck out for Russia. They're going to operate in their own country's interest. They're going to do what's good for the Chinese and good for the Indians, and not what's good for Vladimir Putin. So Vladimir Putin overall is stuck in a difficult position. On one side, he's got a country that he has promised a victory in this war, but he knows that it cannot be won. He knows that at this point, Russia just needs to continue fighting because so many people are dependent on the money that comes from it. People in the oligarchical class, people whom he needs, his own base support, need this war to continue making money. Because aside from the Russian military, what else is spending lots of money at this point? There's nothing. Russia's out of a lot of things spending lots of money. There's fewer and fewer companies. People are working more and more. Inflation is growing by the day because it's all government spending. So looking ahead, Vladimir Putin is in a complex situation. And it's unlikely, though, he will make many significant changes. He will continue to play as he has so far. So what can be done today? What can Vladimir Putin do to change the outcome of this war? The fact is that Vladimir Putin has very few options. His country is in dire economic straits, and the entire situation is pretty bad. He doesn't want to end up like Mussolini or to end up like Gaddafi, but that's becoming ever more realistic of an outcome unless he is able to satisfy the clans that always demand more. But there's a factor here that's quite interesting. Look at the difference of how desperate Russia has become. Now, Russia, when this war began, of course, engaged in different crimes against Ukraine and its people, undoubtedly so. But the way that it's picked up the attacks on the civilian population in Ukraine is pretty dramatic. So why is it, do you think, that right now, as it's negative 15 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Fahrenheit, that we see so often that Russia is attacking things like the power grid in Kiev? Kiev right now, very often, we lack heating. We lack hot and cold water. We lack electricity. It's all because Russia attacks it. And it only attacks it because it hopes that the civilian population within Ukraine will demand that the government surrender. They will say, we can't win. It's better just to give in to the Russians. Now compare that to what Ukraine is doing. Ukraine for years was told to not strike within Russia, that would be a provocation, that would escalate the situation. However, nobody takes as an escalation that Russia continues to attack Ukraine like this. But when Ukraine attacks Russia on legitimate military targets, be it things like the oil refineries, be it things like the Shadow Fleet, be it things like structures within Russia that support the war effort, like factories, Ukraine gets criticized very often by some, but it's totally irrational. The only hope that Vladimir Putin today has of winning is to make sure that things at home seem calm, that it's peaceful, that somehow the Russian people and the Russian elites believe that Russia could still win. He needs them to believe that. But these attacks destabilize that vision. Simultaneously, we see that the attacks that Russia carries out on Ukraine do not change the war. The Ukrainian population has not changed its view. It wants victory over Russia, and it'll continue fighting until it achieves that. But that's why time is not on the side of Russia. Russia today is not dictated in terms of this war. It is not able to finance this war. It doesn't have the soldiers to continue fighting this war. So why would Russia hope that things will turn around? Because today Russia, having few options, is simply looking for some sort of solution, looking for anything whatsoever that might change the math of this war. But as of present, there is nothing that will change this. Vladimir Putin has put himself into a lethal situation, a situation from which his regime will not be able to survive. So when we look at the news, we're trying to understand what's happening now, be very clear. Vladimir Putin, like the Russian officers in Moscow, understand this war cannot be won. They understand very clearly their only hope is to do things like rationing, to create the threat of nuclear missiles being used on Europe. You remember the attack just a few days ago was near Lviv, which is very close to Poland. The whole idea that the Russians have is to project strength, to project the idea that things will get worse unless their demands are met. But we should not pay attention to this. This is absolutely absurd. Russia today is losing this war, and we all see it. Russia today is committing terrorism and committing war crimes against Ukraine in order to persuade the population to give up, and Russia is not succeeding. So today more than ever is why we have to be clear. Russia can be defeated, and Russia is being defeated. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine, and check out this next video that just came on the screen. You'll really enjoy it.